Abidjan didn't wake up, it simply stopped breathing. On 19 May 2025, something terrifying unfolded in silence. No gunfire, no speeches, no warnings, just black screens and rumors. National TV cut to static. Social media went dead. People stared at their phones, waiting for a lie to feel better than this silence. But the only truth that came was fear. President Ouattara had disappeared. No one knew where he was or who was in control. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was already moving, not for headlines, not for glory, but because when chaos knocks, real leaders don't ask permission to act, they just do. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it light something inside you, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to support it but to be part of it. Together we are not watching history, we are shaping it. What began as whispers across the continent is now rising into a silent storm of awakening. And it has only just begun. The silence in Abidjan was not just troubling, it was dangerous. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew that better than anyone. By the time most leaders were still waiting for confirmation, he had already summoned his inner circle. Inside the war room, beneath the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, the mood was tense. No one dared to speak above a whisper. Screens showed blank signals from Ivorian news channels. Intelligence officers offered nothing but fragmented reports. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the clock was ticking. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood still, listening more than he spoke. Then he turned to his chief of operations and asked the question that no one else dared to say aloud. What if President Ouattara is not missing? But being held, the room fell silent. A few heads dropped. It was the worst-case scenario. He didn't need proof. He needed time, and he was running out of it. We will not wait for ECOWAS or the UN. If Ivory Coast has fallen into the hands of traitors, we cannot afford to blink. His voice was calm, but every word cut deep. With that, he issued his orders. A covert unit would cross the northern border into Ivorian territory. No insignias, no national markings. The mission was off the record. Find the truth, he said, but don't expect to come back with it easily. In that moment, Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just responding to a crisis. He was stepping into history. Not for glory, not for revenge, but to protect something greater than borders, the right of a nation to know who is really in charge. The mission had begun, and so had the reckoning. The team moved before midnight. Under heavy cloud cover and radio silence, a blacked-out convoy departed from a remote military outpost near Bobo Dioulasso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had selected the unit himself, not because they were the most decorated, but because they were the most loyal. These men didn't ask questions. They didn't need medals. They followed orders even if the path led straight into chaos. At the head of the unit was Colonel Samari, a ghost in West African military history. He'd once gone missing during the Sahel Triangle operations, presumed dead, only to return 6 months later with intelligence that dismantled 3 terror networks. No one knew exactly how he survived. No one dared to ask. Traoré trusted him without hesitation. He was the kind of man who didn't carry fear, only the mission. The group traveled light. No national insignias, no digital trackers. They split into 2 trucks and crossed the border at a shallow river pass where guards had long abandoned their post. The moment they entered Ivorian territory, the rules changed. This was no longer reconnaissance. It was a silent war. Less than 2 hours and the lead vehicle halted. A drone had picked up unusual heat signatures near a plantation route. Too coordinated for villagers, too silent for aid workers. Samurai ordered a stop and signaled for blackout. The team advanced on foot. Then came the shock. Hidden in a collapsed warehouse just off the dirt road, they found crates of military-grade weapons, none of it Ivorian stock, French markings, Russian optics, and a single folder half burnt, bearing the seal of the Ivorian presidency. Samurai took one look and called it in. "We have a situation," he whispered. "This wasn't just a disappearance. This was planned. Someone is arming factions inside Ivory Coast." Captain Ibrahim Traoré received the transmission in silence. His eyes narrowed. The enemy wasn't at the gate. The enemy had been invited in. And now it was up to him to clean up a crisis no one dared admit existed. The next 24 hours unraveled faster than anyone expected. After the weapons cache was found, Colonel Samari redirected the unit toward Abimpe, a military zone on the outskirts of Abidjan, once used as a logistics hub. Intelligence indicated unusual movement there. Trucks arriving in the middle of the night, unmarked helicopters landing without clearance. Something was being staged in plain sight, and no one was reporting it. As they approached the outer perimeter, the team spread out in silence. Night vision on, radios down, every step measured. They didn't know what they would find, but they were certain it wouldn't be friendly. Just before 3 a.m., a distant whistle cut through the trees, then a burst of gunfire, ambush. From both flanks, armed men emerged from behind brush and broken concrete. They wore no national colors, no badges, only black fatigues and covered faces. The first 5 minutes were chaos. Bullets cracked through the air. Smoke grenades hissed. One of Samari's men went down with a shot to the shoulder. Another returned fire with brutal precision, dropping 2 of the attackers in seconds. It wasn't a battle, it was a message. Someone had been waiting for them. By minute 10, the team had secured partial ground. 2 enemies were down. One had fled into the darkness, but a third, a wounded soldier, was pinned beneath rubble, bleeding and barely conscious. Samurai dragged him out and ordered a medic to keep him alive. The orders were clear: no one dies unless they choose it. Under a makeshift light, the soldier mumbled his words, laced with pain and fear. "We didn't want this," he gasped. "They said we were protecting the nation, but we were only protecting them." "Who?" Samari demanded. The man swallowed hard. Not foreigners, his own men. Ouattara's. They turned on him, locked him up somewhere near the port, said it was for national stability, said the old order had to go. The words struck like thunder. A coup, but not by mercenaries or outside forces. It was an inside job. Ivory Coast was eating itself from within. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was briefed within the hour. He listened carefully, his hands folded, face unreadable. Then he stood. "We're not watching a regime collapse," he said. "We're witnessing a reset. Someone wants to erase the truth before the world sees it." He paused, "But not on my watch." For Traoré, this was no longer a mission. It was a moral line. Someone inside the Ivorian state had betrayed their oath, and someone outside it, him, would now have to restore the balance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't hesitate. The moment he confirmed that President Ouattara had been betrayed by his own men, he made a decision few would dare consider. He would go to Abidjan himself, not with an army, not with a parade, alone and invisible. This wasn't diplomacy, it was surgical intervention. The kind of move no one could trace and no one could deny once it was done. By dusk on 20th May, a Russian-made stealth helicopter, modified for silent approach, was prepared on a remote airstrip in eastern Burkina Faso. Only 5 men knew about the flight, none of them politicians. Traore climbed aboard in full combat gear, no insignia, no identification, just a tactical pack, encrypted comms, and a copy of the intelligence report that had shaken his entire council. The flight path avoided all major radars. They flew low, skimming over forests and rivers, entering Ivorian airspace under total blackout. Not a word was spoken in the cabin. Even the pilot, a seasoned contractor with no allegiance but skill, kept his eyes forward and his hands steady. At 1:17 a.m., they touched down at an abandoned football stadium on the outskirts of Yopougon. The place had once held roaring crowds. Now it was nothing but vines, concrete dust, and silence. It was also the last location where an informant had traced movements linked to the Presidential Guard. An unmarked convoy had stopped there 2 nights earlier and never returned. Traore stepped onto the cracked earth, scanning the stands. Broken glass crunched beneath his boots. He raised his hand to signal his escort to hold position. From here on, he moved alone. Within minutes, he reached the north corridor, beneath the stadium, seating a tunnel, now littered with old plastic chairs and rusted lockers. There, behind a torn canvas barrier, he found what he wasn't supposed to see, a folded national flag stained with blood, and a wall covered in tactical notes, routes, names, shifts. It was a field command post. Someone had been orchestrating movement from this exact spot. Then came the echo of a voice, faint, raspy. He froze. Too late to turn back, Captain. A man stepped out from the shadows, armed, calm, familiar. Doko Yadiba, the former Special Forces commander who disappeared months ago, a ghost in the military rumored to have gone rogue. I see the rumors were true, Traore said, keeping his eyes locked. You're not working alone. Yadiba smirked. Neither are you, but only one of us has something to lose. Traore didn't flinch. I came for peace, not permission. And with those words, the real game began, not with a gunshot, but with a stare. A test of will between a traitor and a man who refused to surrender his continent's future. What happened next was not a battle. It was a betrayal unmasked. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew the moment he looked into Doko Yadiba's eyes that the man before him wasn't just rebelling, he was rewriting the rules of power. Around them, the stadium shadows stirred. Armed men emerged slowly from the tunnels, rifles in hand, faces covered. The trap was set, and Traore had walked straight into it. But he didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply raised both hands and said firmly, "We're not here to pick sides. We're here to protect the truth." The tension broke the air like a wire pulled too tight. One of the masked men twitched. Another hesitated. But Yadiba stepped forward, eyes cold. "You think truth matters now," he said. "Ouattara handed this country to foreigners. We're just taking it back." Captain Traore didn't blink. By holding your president in a basement, by silencing your people and hiding behind shadows. Yadiba raised his rifle slightly, but Traore didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled something from his jacket, a small device. He pressed play. The audio echoed through the concrete corridors. It was Ouattara's voice, tired, weak, afraid. "I do not resign willingly. This is under threat. This is not my will." Gasps spread through the group. Several soldiers exchanged glances. The lie they'd been fed collapsed. Traore stepped forward. "You were told you were saving the country, but what you're doing is burying it alive." One of the men lowered his gun, then another, then a third. Yadiba sensed the shift. His control was slipping. He screamed at them to stand their ground, but no one moved. His voice bounced off the concrete, but the men it once commanded were now frozen in doubt. Then came the final twist. From behind the line, a junior officer stepped forward, barely 25, sweat streaked across his brow. "My brother died in this uniform," he said softly. "He believed in honor, not this." He turned his weapon away from Traore, and just like that the chain broke. Dozens followed. In less than a minute, Yadiba stood alone, his coup crumbling in silence. Traore nodded. "We're not your enemies. We're your mirror. And if you don't like what you see, change it." He didn't arrest Yadiba. He didn't fire a shot. He simply walked past him, his boots echoing through the stadium, and ordered his men to move on the port. Ouattara had to be found. The truth had to be shown. Not just to save a leader, but to save a continent from its own reflection. At exactly 4:02 a.m. on 24 May 2025, the national television of Ivory Coast flickered back to life. No fanfare, no anthem, just a simple frame. President Alassane Ouattara seated in a modest chair, eyes heavy with exhaustion, voice hoarse but steady. He confirmed what many had feared, and what few had dared to believe. He had been held by members of his own inner circle. Men he had trusted. Men who believed that silence was strength and manipulation was governance. And yet somehow he had survived. And more importantly, he had been rescued. He didn't speak for long, but what he said was unforgettable. He looked into the camera, his words cracked with both weariness and clarity, and said, "Captain Ibrahim Traoré came not with threats, not with armies, but with proof, and with honor. I owe my life to him, and so does this nation. The streets of Abidjan, silent for days, erupted not in protest, but in tears. People didn't know whether to cheer or weep. Families came out into the dawn air, still barefoot, holding radios close to their chests. Some cried because they had feared civil war. Others cried because for the first time in years they felt seen, felt protected, not by Paris, not by Washington, but by a man who had nothing to gain except the truth. In Ouagadougou, the reaction was quieter. Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to the presidential compound without celebration. He gave no speech. He refused all interviews. When pressed by aides to address the media, he simply said, "Let the facts speak. Let history decide." But one moment did not go unnoticed. As he stepped out onto the tarmac at Félix-Houphouët-Boigny International Airport, preparing to board the stealth helicopter back to Burkina Faso, a journalist shouted over the crowd, "Captain Traoré, why did you come?" He paused, looked back, and replied calmly, "Because no African leader should vanish in the dark, not without someone coming to find him." Those words would echo across the continent, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. In a region too often held hostage by suspicion, foreign agendas, and internal betrayal, what Traoré did was almost unthinkable. He acted without permission. He crossed a border not to conquer, but to confront. And he did it with the kind of moral authority that no bullet can silence. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Several members of the Ivorian Presidential Guard were arrested. Investigations uncovered a network of foreign-backed contractors who had provided intelligence and equipment to the rebel faction. Protests erupted not against Traoré, but in support of him. Young people in Dakar, Bamako, Kinshasa, and Nairobi painted murals of his likeness, not as a president, but as a sentinel, a symbol of an Africa that no longer bows. But not everyone celebrated. Foreign media attempted to frame the operation as interference. A reckless intervention, they called it. Western analysts debated whether Burkina Faso had violated protocol. But on the ground, among the people, the truth was simpler. A brother had saved a brother. A soldier had refused to look away. And for once, Africa had answered its own call. Captain Ibrahim Traoré never claimed victory. In fact, when asked later whether the mission was a success, he shook his head. This wasn't a mission, he said. This was a warning to those who believe they can operate in darkness, a warning to those who still think Africa is for sale, and a warning to those who underestimate the fire burning in a generation that refuses to forget Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and now perhaps Traoré. The sun rose slowly over Abidjan that morning. For the first time in days, the sky was clear. Soldiers returned to their barracks, civilians to their markets. The air smelled of gunpowder, yes, but also of something else, a fragile, unfamiliar scent. Hope. And in that silence, long after the headlines faded, one truth remained. Africa may still be divided by borders, but the heartbeat of its people is beginning to march in one rhythm. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global powers, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire burning in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it ignite something within you, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to stand together. Because this is no longer just a headline, it's a movement. A silent storm is rising across this continent. What began as whispers in the dark is now becoming a wave of awakening. And history will not be written by those who stayed silent. It will be written by those who chose to act. Certainly. Below is Book 13, 1000 to it approx. 1000 words viet doi dang. By Hok. Rutra tu tuanbo kao chuyen chin tri, kichtin gyua. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, va kwok hung hoang, o bo bien nga. By viet su dong ishwan fong trang trong truyen, kam hung so sak. Fu hop voi boy kan jia. Chin trichao pi hien jai. This story is more than just a dramatic account of political turmoil or a daring mission. It is a profound reflection on leadership courage and the soul of a continent still wrestling with the shadows of its past and the burdens of its future. What Captain Ibrahim Traoré did in the early hours of 21st May 2025 was not just a military maneuver. It was a lesson in moral responsibility, one that echoes far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso or Ivory Coast. The first and perhaps most urgent lesson is that silence can be lethal. When the city of Abidjan went dark, when no statements were made, when no news came, chaos filled the vacuum. In Africa, where information is often controlled and fear weaponized, silence is never neutral. It is a strategy, a signal, a tool for manipulation, and unless confronted quickly, silence grows teeth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré recognized this. He didn't wait for a press release. He didn't wait for international consensus. He acted because he understood that in moments of uncertainty, delay is complicity. Another powerful lesson is that loyalty must never replace truth. What happened in Ivory Coast was not a foreign invasion, it was betrayal from within. Men in uniforms who once swore oaths to defend the state turned against it. They believed that by controlling the narrative they could control the people, but they forgot one thing: you cannot imprison truth forever. It leaks, it breathes, and eventually it roars. Traoré's response reminded Africa that loyalty to individuals must never come before loyalty to justice and nationhood. Leadership in this story is redefined. Traoré did not lead from behind a podium or through a cascade of speeches. He led from the front literally. He boarded that stealth helicopter not for ceremony, but for sacrifice. He risked his life not for political capital, but for a principle. In a world of presidents who hide behind protocol, he chose presence. He chose proximity. He chose to look into the eyes of those who betrayed their nation and offer them a chance to stand down without bloodshed. That kind of leadership is not taught. It is born from conviction. We also learn that the most dangerous threats to African sovereignty often wear familiar faces. The enemy isn't always a foreign invader. Sometimes it is a colleague, a commander, a friend. The character of Doko Yadiba is symbolic not just as a rebel, but as a reflection of the quiet rot within institutions across the continent. The Yadibas of Africa are many well-dressed, well-trained, and deeply compromised. They use the language of patriotism while selling the soul of their countries to external interests or personal ambitions. The only antidote to such internal decay is clarity, both moral and strategic. Traoré confronted that threat not with revenge, but with resolve. He didn't execute Yadiba, he exposed him, and in doing so, he reminded the continent that justice is strongest when it wears restraint. There is also a lesson about unity, real unity, not the kind found in slogans and summit speeches. When the junior officer in Yadiba's squad turned his gun away, it was not an act of mutiny, it was an act of conscience. That moment signaled a shift. The youth of Africa are no longer interested in blind obedience. They are hungry for purpose, for truth, and for leaders who reflect their values. The soldier's defection is a symbol of the new Africa, one that will not follow orders, simply because they are barked by a superior, but one that thinks, questions, and acts according to justice. Furthermore, this story teaches us that intervention does not have to mean invasion. Western narratives often paint African-led actions as chaotic, dangerous, or illegitimate. But what Traore did was measured, ethical, and precise. He respected borders, but not at the expense of humanity. He acted not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. And the fact that ordinary citizens wept in joy, not fear, when Ouattara returned safely says more than any international report ever could. The power of proof is also essential. Traoré's turning point in the confrontation came not from bullets, but from a voice recording. A simple, trembling confession from a captured president dismantled an entire network of lies. In a digital age where disinformation spreads like wildfire, evidence, real, raw, unedited, remains the most powerful weapon. And in the hands of the right leader, truth is not just a defense, it is an offensive force. It forces people to choose sides. It cuts through confusion, it breaks illusions, and it demands action. Lastly, perhaps the most profound lesson is this: Africa's salvation will not come from abroad. No envoy from Europe, no resolution from the UN, no check from Washington. It will come from within, from men and women who choose to act even when they have nothing to gain. Traore didn't need to help Ouattara. They were not from the same political bloc. They did not share advisors. But Traore saw in Ouattara's abduction not just a crisis of a neighboring state, but a threat to the moral compass of West Africa. In his final words at the airport, "Because no African leader should vanish in the dark," Traore reframed the meaning of Pan-Africanism. It is no longer just about trade or treaties. It is about guardianship, about stepping up when others step back, about refusing to let fear dictate Africa's future. In the end, the lesson from this story is both simple and seismic. Africa is watching itself now, and the leaders who rise will not be the loudest but the bravest, those who speak less and act more, those who carry the burden of truth even when it's heavy, those who do not wait for the West to write the script, but pick up the pen and write a future of their own. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not rescue a president. He rescued a principle, and in doing so, he reminded an entire generation what it means to fight not just for a flag, but for the soul of a continent.